So first, as an introduction, say yes to palm oil, because one of the presentations say no to palm oil. The reason is that it's a very important commodity economically, not only for Indonesia, but also for many countries in the world. But it's a notorious commodity because sometimes it have a negative impact to the environment. So what I'm going to talk about this morning is how oil palm intensification can reconcile the economic and the environmental objectives. This is a work of a big group in Indonesia under the leadership of Professor Patricio Grassini. So palm oil is the main producer of palm oil, of course, and the oil is used for many purposes, ranging from the vegetable oil, foods, cosmetics, and also as biofuel. Indonesia is the greatest producer of palm oil, with the annual production nearly 50 million tons. And it's planted on about 16 million hectares of land, and 40% of which is under the management of smallholders. So this is the smallholder oil palm plantation looks like. And this long-handled sickle is for harvesting the fresh fruit bunch. This is how the fresh fruit bunch look like. And the trucks from the mill come to the farm, and the farmer get the cash on site of about $160 per tons of the bunch. And every tons of the bunch would produce about 200 tons of oil. So the problem is that the national production in the past has been dependent so much on the expansion of the land, and the increase in the yield has been very low. And unfortunately, some of the expansion were to the expense of high carbon stock and high biodiversity land. Although recently there have been some progress in which less of the expansion is on forest. So the future demands is increasing, especially of the national program of using biodiesel, and also international demand for the biodiesel as well as for food. So what we are going to convey here is how we can intensify the management here so that the yield increase. So the encroachment to the nearby forest will be much reduced. And we are very fortunate that we have a project funded by the Norwegian government on the intensification of oil palm, whether it can reconcile the economic and the environmental objectives. So the project is a 4-year project under the leadership of Professor Patricio Grassini from UNL. And the partners, many of whom are in the audience now, come from Indonesian Oil Palm Research Institute, Indonesian Agency for Agricultural Research and Development, which now transformed to the National Research and Innovation Agency, NGOs and universities, as well as the farmers group. The focus is on independent smallholder plantation on mineral soil. And the goal is to identify the causes of yield gap and to evaluate the effective management options to increase the yield. We conducted the research in 6 provinces on 2 major islands, and these 2 islands are very important for palm oil production. And the main activities include a survey of over 1,000 households, and demonstration of the best management practices, and generating information for the improvement of the policy on oil palm management. So as you can see here is that the current actual yield, I don't know whether I can go back. The red one? Yeah, okay. So the actual yield only about 14 tons per hectare per year in terms of fresh fruit bunch. From fresh fruit bunch to oil is about 20%. And this represents only 42% of the attainable yield. The attainable yield is close to 30 tons of FFB per year per hectare. The main reason is the nutrient imbalance and insufficiency, the harvesting inappropriateness, palm stand weeding, and so forth. So you can see, if you go to the field, a very clear symptoms of nutrient deficiencies, and this is very clear for potassium, magnesium, and boron. The reason is that the farmer don't use or use too little amount of nutrient. And the severe deficiency is on potassium, because potassium is relatively more expensive than other fertilizers. So we conducted a pairwise comparison of a field experiment to compare the best management practice and the farmer's reference as a reference practice. It was conducted on 30 pair of fields. Each pair is on one farmer's field. So this what the best management practices include. First is harvesting criteria and frequency. Under the farmer's practice, the harvest is normally once every 2 weeks. And I should also say that the harvest starts 3 years after replanting, and it will continue on and on until 25 years after replanting. So the BMP is to change it into every 10-day harvest. And pruning and weeding is also important, but fertilizer management is one of the most important. And we include in the recommendation the higher rate of potassium and addition of magnesium and boron. This is how the farm looked like after 3 years of the BMP management implementation. You can see that the symptoms of nutrient deficiency is much less here than it is under the reference plot. And on the yield, it's very clear that with time, the BMP has a much better and better yield compared to the reference. And what it means to the net profit, of course, it's also much better for the BMP. Although in the reference, there is also a big increase, but this is mainly because of the better price of the fresh fruit bunch in the year 2021 and 2022. Not only that, from the viewpoint of greenhouse gas emissions, it's much lower under the BMP than the reference. And the GHG emission include here the difference in the carbon stock of the biomass and the necromass, and also carbon loss in the soil, as well as emissions from chemicals, including the direct and indirect emission of N2O. And the greenhouse gas intensity, which is the emission per ton of FFB, is also much lower for the BMP than the reference. So was the eco-efficiency, which is the ton of CO2 equivalent by 1,000 US dollar. So this is much lower compared to the reference. So if we are successfully scale out this best management practice, what we can expect is that Indonesia will have extra 6.5 million tons of CPO. And this equivalent to the land saving of 2 million hectares. So we don't have to expand the land, but only intensify in the same agricultural land. And this positively impacting the livelihood of over 2 million households, and a generation of extra income of about 5.3 billion dollars. So the main message is that we can convey from this research is that there is large exploitable yield gap in smallholder farmers. And so there are lots of opportunity to increase the yield and profits, and this will benefit the local community. There are also opportunity for the country to produce more CPO on existing plantation area. And the better agronomic management is the key to close the yield gap of existing plantation. The main management intervention, including improvement of nutrient management, field upkeep, and the weeding and so forth. And with that, we can expect much better yield and reduction in the greenhouse gas emission per unit of production and per unit of profit. And what it means to the policy is that we need a stronger extension services, and also a better management, and also facilitation of the input, especially fertilizer, including potassium fertilizer. Currently, the subsidy is not provided for oil palm plantation, let alone for the potassium. And there is opportunity for Indonesia as well as other countries in the tropics to implement a better management, so that we can solve not only the environmental but also the economic and agronomic problems. And we disseminate this result, including in the high impact journal such as Nature Sustainability, and we are in preparation of special issue of oil palm intensification in the Journal of Agricultural System. And we had a roundtable discussion in Jakarta last January. It's about how we can improve the nutrient management, and we produced what we call the Jakarta Declaration, which was endorsed by many stakeholders who have concern in sustainable agriculture. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Fahmuddin. Very impressive when you show that it's possible to increase profit and productivity and reduce the environmental footprint through better agronomy. We have time for one or perhaps two questions for Fahmuddin. Please raise your hand if you want to ask Fahmuddin any question. Yes.
Thank you very much. I am Oscar Ortiz, Senior Director of Crop-Based Systems in the 1CGIR system. My question is about which factors would be limiting the scaling of those best practices and approaches so that this could be really used in a large by a large number of farmers or large areas.
Barriers for scaling.
Yeah, extension services is one of the limiting factor because currently in Indonesia at least that most of the extension service is only for rice production. But there is a scheme which is called plasma scheme. This is association or assistance from the large plantation. Large plantation means large. One unit of meal usually cover an area of about 5,000 to 7,000 hectares of land. And surrounding that, there are plasma farmers which receive the technical assistance from the large plantation. But there are independent farmers who receive very little assistance in terms of information, in terms of supply. So that's the limitation. And also uncertainty of the availability of the supplies. So that's, I guess, one of also very important limitation.
And if I may add, Fahmuddin, an important reason for all this year for not implementing better agronomy in oil palm plantations was the belief that because these farmers planted their fields with a non-certified planting material, then there is nothing that they can do to raise their productivity, and they have to wait 25 years for the next replanting cycle to plant a certified planting material that with higher yield. But our study shows that even if the farmers planted their fields with non-certified planting material, they can still increase the productivity substantially through better agronomy. So as you can see, there is a kind of disconnection between policy and research that through this project we are trying to overcome. Maybe one more question, yes? Sorry. Yeah.
How much depth of water required for growing oil palm?
Okay, yeah, this is a water for full conference, so we need to talk about water. Do you have, yeah, how much water oil palm consumes?
So the land suitability for oil palm area, the ideal rainfall amount is about 1,700 millimeter per annum, and it can go to 4,000 millimeter. What is needed is even distribution all the year round.
All right, let's give a round of applause to Fahmuddin. All right, I'm gonna now present about soybean in the US. As I said before, originally we were planning for my colleague Shen Yuan from China to talk about rice in Asia, but unfortunately he could not make it to the conference, so we are filling that spot with this presentation about intensification of soybean systems in the US. All right. There you go. Come on, one more. There you go. All right, so I'm gonna try to summarize in 15 minutes the main finding from a multi-state, multi-year research project that we conducted with colleagues from 10 universities across the US and which was led by University of Nebraska. The main objective of this project was to understand which were the major constraints for soybean yields in the north-central US region. and try to design management packages that can help farmers to raise both their productivity and profit, and following the concept of sustainable intensification, also do so in a way in which those packages minimize the environmental footprint. Now, the very first step was to try to understand what was the cause for the yield gap in soybean systems. And when we talk about the yield gap, we refer to the difference between the potential yield, which is shown there with the red bar, versus the average farmer yield. And what we always find is that there is this gap, this productivity gap, between what can be potentially be achieved on an acre of land given the radiation, carbon dioxide, and temperature, versus what farmers achieve in practice. And the question therefore is, okay, what are those factors that limit my productivity to reach that potential? Are those gaps related with poor nutrition, as Fahmuddin showed before for all palm, or maybe they are related with overall poor crop management, diseases, pests, and so forth? So as a first step on this project, we tried to understand which were the causes for those gaps in soybean systems. Now, trying to discover what the causes for yield gaps are is something that is very difficult to do through classic agronomic research, because it will take just too many years, too many sites to get something clean. It's very difficult to evaluate under field conditions all the possible management factors that may be explain productivity gaps. And finally, we typically run our experiments in our backyard, and then we have quite limited ability to scale out to farmers' fields. And then there is perhaps a more important point, that is, many times we start our research based on what we believe is important rather than what is indeed important. And just to illustrate that point, this is research that we conducted in Indonesia a few years ago, in which we tried to identify which were the major causes for the yield gaps in rice and maize systems in Indonesia. And what we found was that nutrients and pests were the most important factors explaining productivity gaps in those systems. Now, at the same time, we ran a survey across extensionists and researchers working on rice and maize in Indonesia, and we asked them what they believe were the major constraints for yields. And what we found was that the expectations or the perception from our colleagues was quite different from reality, with most of them indicating that actually genotype and damage by drought or by rats or by other kind of stresses were more important than nutrients. So this is a kind of a next example to illustrate that sometimes our perceptions are disconnected from reality. And that has implications on the way we allocate resources on research and development programs and how we orient our policy. So to try to avoid these kind of disconnections, in this project what we did was we, instead of going out there and running experiments, we used farmers' data as a method to understand which were the main factors that were explaining productivity gaps in soybean systems in the US. And the idea was to analyze farmers' data using advanced statistical methods together with ways by which you can group fields according to their biophysical background to make sure that you are running a fair comparison. Then try to, once those yield gap factors are identified, try to put them together or combine them into technological packages, test them in the field, evaluate them for their capacity to deliver yield and profit increases, and eventually learn from that and try to refine those new systems in a way that increase farmers' yields and profit. So that was the overall idea behind this project. As I said before, I'm the one presenting about the project, but this was work conducted by more than 10 universities. And we are talking about one of the most productive areas of the world, the Corn Belt, that produces nearly 30% of the global soybean production. And the average yield now is quite high, already represents nearly 70 to 80% of the yield potential. So as you can imagine, it's not that easy to find opportunities to raise the yields further. So everything started by collecting survey data across more than 9,000 fields across the US. This is a map that shows the US North Central region. The green color in the map represents the soybean area, and each of those red dots is one field for which we collected data on yield and management practices. That's the kind of survey that we run with the help of extensionists and researchers, where we ask farmers to provide us with the geolocation of their fields, their average yields, their management practices, inputs, and so forth. And now, having 9,000 fields from the Corn Belt is great, but you can also run into troubles when you try to make comparisons, because you can have one irrigated field in Nebraska with very little rainfall and with a soil type that is completely different from the one that another field may have, for example, in Ohio, with a different rainfall, with a different climate. So the question is, okay, how can we make sense of this data when you have so much variation in the climate and soil background? And to do so, what we did was to group those fields according to their climate and soil type. So each of the colors in these maps represents a sort of agroecological zone that has same climate and same soil type, and all of those 9,000 fields were grouped according to their soils and climate, so that we make comparisons among fields that has the same climate and the same soil as background, and therefore the comparison is fair. And this is a figure that shows the farmers' yields, the distribution of farmers' yields for each of those climate and soil type combinations. And what you can see there is that for a given climate and soil type, there is quite large variation in productivity. And the question is, if the fields were grouped by according to their soil and according to their weather to make fair comparisons, what we have, for example, in one of those climate zones, why do we have variation from 2.5 tons to 4.5? And the answer is probably because of management. Probably these farmers are doing something that is different from these farmers, and therefore, if we can understand what those high yields fields are doing, that may give us some insights about how we can increase the productivity of the system. So the idea here was very simple, was to try to compare the practices between the high yield fields versus the low yield fields for a given type of soil and climate, and using that as a starting point to figure out which management practices can be fine-tuned to obtain further increase in yields and profit. Those are the main findings from analysis. This figure here shows different factors. Shows different factors rank according to their importance. And what we found was that in most of the cases, planting date, fungicide, maturity group will explain differences between high yields and low yield fields. And then there were other factors such as tillage, nematodes, row spacing, and seed treatments that can explain part of the variation. But again, this gives us a very first starting point to start reflecting about what these farmers can do to increase their productivity and profit in a sustainable way. So some of those factors seems to be very important, such as planting date, so we decided to explore them in more depth. So in this figure here, what I'm showing is the actual farmer yield plotted against planting date, and in most of the cases you can see that as the planting gets delayed, the yield declines. And therefore planting date seems to be one key management factor that can be modified, can be tuned by farmers to increase the productivity. And without not too much cost, because that has no cost indeed. It's also a matter of logistics. What's also interesting from this analysis is not only what you find to be explaining yield gaps, but also what you find not to be explaining the yield gap, because there may be cases in which farmers may be using inputs that they don't really need, and therefore that represents an opportunity to increase their profit by cutting on costs. And an example of that is a seeding rate. What we found was that in all cases, there was no relationship between yield and seeding rate, but still farmers were using very, very high seeding rates. So here is an opportunity to increase profit, not necessarily by increasing yield, but rather by cutting on costs by reducing seeding rates. All right, so let's try to put all together now and to validate the findings. So what we did was, for each of these climate and soil domains, we designed a package of technologies targeted for each of them with the aim of increasing farmers' yields and profit. And to do so, we took the results from the previous analysis and we tried to put them into a package that is simple to adopt and profitable. Because we wanted to keep things simple, we only consider things that can be easily modified by farmers, such as planting date, maturity group, or seeding rates, and we did not consider things that will create a mess in the logistics of the farmers, such as, for example, narrow row spacing, or things that are very difficult to handle, like nematodes. So we try to keep things simple here and put together packages of technologies that can be easily adoptable by the farmers and can generate a quick and large increase in profit. So to do so, we designed these packages for each climate and soil domain, and then we went out there to the field, and working with farmers, we evaluate our improved management treatment against the farmer dominant practices in field strips like this across 50 fields over 3 years, summing up to a total of 150 side-by-side comparison of our improved management treatment versus the reference treatment that follows the dominant practices from the farmer. And that's where the experiments were located. As you can see, we have a very good representation of the whole region. And here are the results. These figures here shows the yield of the improved treatment that basically follows our recommendation based on the analysis of the farmer's data, plotted against the control treatments that follows the dominant farmer management. The red line is the one-to-one line, which means no difference between the treatments. If the points fall above the red line, it means that there is an advantage of the improved management treatment compared with the farmer reference. And what we found consistently across the 3 years is that our improved management treatment will outperform the farmer's management in terms of yield and also in terms of profit. On average, we were able to close the existing yield gap by 40%, and in doing so, we also increased the profit by $76 per hectare. And again, this is for a system, for a crop system that already achieves very high yield. So even though these increases in yield may look a little bit small, for a farmer that is already harvesting nearly 4 tons per hectare, it means a lot. And again, remember that what we propose for the improved management practice treatment were things that farmers can easily adopt, such as early planting date, use of a foliar fungicide, fine-tuning maturity group, and cutting on seeding rates. Things that farmers can do tomorrow on their farm, and by doing so generate a yield increase and an associated increase in profit. So a nice opportunity for soybean farmers in the US to produce more, to increase their profit, and do so in a very sustainable way, because none of these suggested practices will have an environmental impact. So finally, to conclude, I think that I show you here a nice case of a study where the combination of farmers' data and a special framework allow us to identify causes of yield gaps across a large geography, which in turn it helps us to orient our research and develop technological packages that consistently increase farmers' yields and profit. And something that I want to highlight here is that eventually this approach can be applied in any other part of the world where farmers' data can be collected, and that I believe has great potential to help us to orient better the way we invest in agriculture. And finally, at a global context, also we believe that there is a great promise from this approach on their potential to accelerate the discovery and adoption of yield improving practices. So thank you very much, and I think we can open for questions now. Everybody's shy. Yes.
Thank you, Patricio. Going back to the question about water, this management of the planting date, what's the relationship of that with water availability and so on?
I would say that it has very few implications for water, because usually here the planting is more driven by temperature rather by water availability. So farmers will go and start planting when the soil temperature is reasonable. And what we found in terms of use of water is that planting early or planting late won't necessarily mean to use more or less water. But in all cases, planting earlier will give you more yield per unit of water. So by planting earlier, you increase the efficiency in the use of water. I'm doing so many things here. I'm the chair, I'm the speaker.
We're always striving for yield, but along with that, are we sacrificing quality or the potential of that, in particular soy, in terms of the quality of the soy that we're producing? Did you have any reflection on that at all, or? Its oil content.
Yeah, sure. In terms of our soybean project, what we found was that in all cases, the environmental impact of our proposed management interventions are positive. We are, having a high yield crop will have implications in terms of fixation, for example. A soybean crop that yields more also fixes more nitrogen, and eventually that's better for the nitrogen balance of the soil. Something that, Rorik, that we also found through our analysis of the farmers' data was that, for example, no-till, we found it to have a small penalty in yield. But we did not propose, farmers to switch back to conventional tillage, because there are many other benefits related with no-till that are not necessarily yield per se. For example, better control of erosion, better soil health in general. Also, you lower fuel use and you cut on cost. So the management practices that we put together on those packages were not necessarily only based on yield, but we're also looking at the system as a whole. So even though tillage could give us an extra yield increase, we decided not to propose to till fields, because there are other things that are not really with yield that are also very important, thinking on the long-term sustainability of the system. Okay, third one and last one. And sorry for abandoning you here on this side of the classroom, but the setting is not the best, as you can see.
I was just wondering if you delineated which fields were using cover crops or not in their annual rotation.
That would have been great. To have like a reasonable sample size to also evaluate the effect of cover crops. But unfortunately, during the years in which we collected the survey data, which were from 2016 to 2019 or even before, there were not that many cover crops out there, and therefore we were not able to run any comparison in terms of any potential advantage of using cover crops in terms of increasing the overall system performance. What we know is that cover crops will typically lead to a small penalty on the yield of the primary grain crop like corn and soybean, but sometimes that small yield penalty may be offset by other potential benefits such as reduction on nitrogen leaching, control of erosion, and other things. But unfortunately we didn't have the data to test that in our project. But having said that, I think that there is great potential to apply the same approach to evaluate the impact, the on-farm impact of cover crops on farmers' profit, yields, and so forth. Yeah.
Were all of those fields just soybean continuous, or were some of them soybean corn? Did you keep track of what was going in?
Yeah, I'm so sorry I didn't have enough time to give more background about the system. I would have loved to have an extra 1 minute or two, but Fatima is very strict with the time, and she won't allow me to do that. Pretty much all the soybean in the States is rotated with maize. So the only prior crop that you have is corn, which is good. It's not like Paraguay or Argentina, where you have continuous soybean, which is not that sustainable. Thank you. All right, I think that we are ready to move to the next speaker. So now I'm going to switch to the role of a chair again. And now, who are we going to have next? Alencar. Okay, great. So we already took you to Indonesia, then back to the States, and now we are going to take you all the way south to Brazil. And here is my colleague Alencar Zanon, who is a professor at the University Federal of Santa Maria. in the southern tip of Brazil, very, very close to Argentina, so you are almost perfect. And Alencar graduated from Santa Maria, then became professor, and over the past, I don't know, too many years, we have been working together on intensification of Brazilian cropping systems, again, with a focus on improving farmers' profit, and try to do so in a way in which is also compatible with environmental goals. So Alencar, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricio. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. And today I will talk about what we are doing in Brazil in the last few years. So my name is Alencar Zanon. I am professor in agronomy in south of Brazil, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much, Water for Food Institute, for the opportunity. So I will talk about intensification of Brazilian agriculture, reconciling protection of the Amazon forest with agriculture production. So let's start contextualizing the Brazil as a food producer and soybean production in Brazil. Brazil now is a major producer and exporter of soybean, maize, and beef in the world. In this growing season, we plant around 42.5 million hectares with soybean. The agriculture production has progressively shifted from the south, when I live, near Argentina and Uruguay, to shift it to the Cerrado, central part of Brazil. Soybean production drove deforestation during the late 1990s and early 2000. In between 2005 to 2015, was marked by a tangible progress in reducing the deforestation. So Amazon basin still has 330 million hectares. And the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine, sharp increase in crop commodity prices, and desire of government to quickly recover from negative economic impact. So here we can see how the soybean farm advanced in Brazilian Cerrado. Here we have the soybean farmer, here the Cerrado. So the three objectives with this presentation were: first, investigate recent trends post-2007 in soybean yield and expansion, estimate soybean maize extra production potential through intensification or existent cropland area, and assess environment and production outcomes for different scenarios of intensification. These are the three objectives of our work. So let's start. The panel A here, there is the soybean area between 2007 to 2019. So soybean area has expanded around 1.4 million hectares per year in this period. If you take a look here, in the last 5 years, the soybean expansion in the Amazon account for 1/3 of the land convert. So we need to put a lot of attention here. In the panel B, we can see the soybean yield increase by breeding and management. So yield improvement has been slower in the Amazon and Cerrado than Pampa and the Atlantic forest. We are talking about 15 and 27 kilograms per hectare per year in the Amazon and Cerrado, when in the Atlantic forest and Pampa is around the double. And here we have the map of Brazil, the 4 biomes, Amazon, Cerrado, Atlantic forest, and Pampa. Here the blue color shows where the places are growing soybean now. So the soybean start here, it come to here, central part of Brazil. This panel showing the cycle soybean production increase to 2. In red, cropland expansion, and in green, yield improvement. So the increase in agricultural outputs has larger results from the cropland expansion, rather than the increase in yield, mainly in the Amazon and Cerrado. So there is a big opportunity in Brazil now, because Patricia was talking about a little or small yield gap in the United States, but in Brazil, like Indonesia, we have a large yield gap in soybean and maize. This figure here shows us the opportunity, or the really huge opportunity. So the P chart showing the average yield in green and the exploitable yield gaps in yellow. Exploitable yield gap means the difference between the average yield and the 8% of the yield potential. So let's focus in Cerrado. Looks here, we are talking a really big, a really huge opportunity. Why? The first thing is there is a high water limit yield potential. We are talking about 5.4 tons per hectare. Stable yield with internal coefficient of variation 4%. A large yield gap, more than 50%, and a large area, 17 million hectares. So, if in Brazil we can do almost the same that the farmers here in US are doing, or in other words, achieving or reaching 8% of the yield potential, we can produce more, 1.7 ton per hectares in soybean. This represents a production increase in 30 million tons, and we can crop in the same growing season maize. The opportunity is 3.2 tons per hectare, only doing a good management practices in agronomy, and this represent around 54 million tons production increase in maize. So it's a big opportunity. And looking in another way, environmental way, we can save around 9.4 million hectares of land that may come from Amazon or Cerrado. So this is a huge opportunity. And let's compare with what Patricio shows and Argentina, the second and largest soybean production in the world. So in US, like Patricio told us, the yield potential is 4.8 tons per hectare, and the yield gap is around 22%. In Argentina, the yield potential is less, around 3.9 tons per hectare, and the yield gap is around 32%. In Brazil, there is a higher yield potential, 5.4 tons per hectare, and the largest yield gap, around 50%. So it's a really big opportunity. With these scenarios, we look the future, the next 15 years. So what happened, or what would be happen in 15 years? If the farmers keep doing the same things, we call business as usual scenarios. So you expand around 1.4 million hectares per year and increase the yield that we did in the past years. The second scenarios is no cropland expansion. So keep doing the same things when we are talking about yield, but no more cropland expansions. And the third scenario is we call intensification. So we will accelerate of rates of yield improving for soybean and maize, closing the yield gap, future adoption of second crop maize on existing soybean area wherever the climate makes double cropping possible, or in other words, with less risk, and intensify the pasture-based livestock system. So we can bring some hectares from the intensification of the pasture system to the soybean. So this is very important, these three scenarios. So first, let's look at the soybean production. There is the next 15 years here and the annual soybean production. So if we keep doing the same things, we will produce a lot of soybean, almost the double. But we will increase a massive land conversion from 36 to 59 million hectares. So this is a lot of hectares. In no cropland expansion, we are here. This is good because no more area, but 40% lower soybean and second crop maize production compared with these scenarios. And the third scenarios, the intensification, here we have the soybean production increase to around 162 million tons by 2035, mitigating the opportunity cost associated with these scenarios here. This is a scenarios of soybean production. Now let's go to the environment outcomes. With the same scenarios, there is the annual gross incoming, billions dollars, and the annual global warming potential. So in these scenarios, that the farmers will keep doing the same things, we will increase or we will bring 5.7 million hectares of forest and savanna into soybean cultivation. And will be associated with 1,955 million tons CO2 equivalent released due to land conversion. So in one way, we win a lot of money, but it's very hard when we think in climate change. The second scenarios, no cropland expansion. So this is very good because we will avoid deforestation and reduce the global warming potential, like we can see here, but incurs into a huge opportunity cost. We are talking about $447 billion in this period of time. It's a lot of money. In the intensification scenarios, we can have a reasonable balance between increased agriculture outputs and reducing the negative environment outcomes, environment impact. So we can achieve aggregate gross income from soybean and second crop maize that represent 85% of the business as usual scenarios, and the total global warming potential decrease by 58% into these scenarios. So sounds good. Besides these results that show we can conciliate in Brazil the increase of soybean production and the environment protection, we have now more impact in our research with building a Giga Brazil team. This is very important for us. Doing extension, in other words, take the results from the paper and transferring to the farmers in all corners of Brazil. And in teaching too, we create some graduate courses looking to show the student how we can grow a sustainable production in Brazil. And with this motivation, we didn't stop. Now we start in a new project like Indonesia did, and the US too. The new project name is 5+10, Intensify Soybean Maize System in the Brazilian Cerrado. The 5 means attainable yield in the safra in Brazil, and 10 the attainable yield in maize in second safra, or safrinha. So the goals of this project was foster a sustainable intensification of the soybean maize production system in the Brazilian Cerrado. Here is the project description. It will be a really boot on the ground project, like this team did in Indonesia and the US. So we'll go to the farmers, first make a diagnostic. After that, we carry out experiments side by side, based on our diagnostic and based on the farmer's management. And after that, we will scaling the results. And there are more opportunities like disruptive projects. In Cerrado, if we use irrigation, we can grow 3 crops in the same year: soybean, maize, and beans, or another crop. For that, the governor of Mato Grosso came to here today talk about this, a really big opportunity for us. So the conclusions are, yes, it's possible in Brazil to conciliate the increased soybean maize production and protecting the fragile ecosystem. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Alencar. Another nice example about how agricultural intensification can help to reconcile production and environmental goals. On the one hand, trying to protect the environment, but also try to be sensitive to the economic aspirations of countries to develop. So again, thank you very much for the presentation. We have time for 1, 2 questions? Yeah, maybe 1 question. Otherwise, Fatima will get very, very mad, and we don't want that. Any question? Yes. Hold on. Yeah.
In recent, you said in last 5 years there is 1/3 of soybean expansion. Is it depend on rainfall or irrigation, the cropping?
In Brazil, the main producer farmers depend on the rain. But if we can grow 3 crops per year, we need irrigation, because around 4 or 5 months we don't have rain in the Brazilian Cerrado.
Maybe you want to talk a little bit the sources of water for that irrigation.
Okay, now the governor come here to build a project with Water for Food Institute, looking for determine how much water is available to do irrigation. Christopher told us the last week we can start with the water available, around 3 million hectares now.
Any other question? If not, we move to the next speaker. Who is it? Romulo. Okay, great. Yeah, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Romulo Lolato from Kansas State University. Romulo is also originally from Brazil. He did his PhD, he completed his PhD in Oklahoma State University, and then he moved to Kansas State, where he holds this position where he works on wheat research and extension. And Romulo is going to talk today about opportunities to improve profits in wheat fields in the U.S. Great Plains. Romulo, it's a great pleasure to have you here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricio, and good morning, everyone. Great to be here with you today. I do appreciate the invitation to be here sharing some thoughts on one of my favorite subjects, which is intensifying wheat production in the U.S. And today, I'm going to touch a little bit about wheat production in the U.S. as a whole, and we're going to get into Kansas, which is the largest wheat producing state in the U.S. Very well, just as some background, what's the importance of wheat produced in the US? So we have here the US within the wheat global supply chain. The red bar is the US. So you can see here that we are the 4th largest wheat producing country in the world. And we're also the 3rd largest wheat exporting country in the world, accounting for about 12% of the total wheat exports there. So very important within the global scenario of wheat supply. Another thing that I wanted to call your attention to these graphs here is the highlight in yellow, which is the Ukraine. And with the socio-economic conflicts that are going on in Ukraine now, that 10% wheat exports total coming from Ukraine that might be compromised make this type of work even more crucial. Wheat in the US is the crop that is grown in the largest number of states, as you can see in this map out here. And we have different wheat types, and we have different end uses of wheat as well, which are the different colors that you see in this map. So essentially, the large area in green in the bottom, that's hard red winter wheat. That's wheat that is grown for bread. And it is a winter type of crop, meaning that it's planted in the fall, harvested in the subsequent summer. In that region as well, we also have hard white winter wheat, which is essentially the same crop, but it has a white grain, and so it makes for a whole grain bread of a lighter color. In the Pacific Northwest out there, they grow many types, but one that I'm focusing there is soft white wheat that is used in cakes and noodles and heavily exported to Asia. North Dakota and South Dakota, we have spring wheat, actually hard red spring wheat, which you see there, probably the highest quality bread wheat that we grow in the US. We also have durum wheat, the one that makes pasta, right? And finally, if we look at the eastern states, a little bit more spread area there, but we have soft red winter wheat, wheat that is used to make crackers and cookies and things along these lines. So a lot of different wheat classes, a lot of different end uses as well for that wheat product. But if we look at the US as a whole, what we can see is definitely a trend in reducing wheat area over the years. With that, also a reduction in wheat production over the years. Right? Even though our yields have been increasing to some extent, that really hasn't been able to offset the production that is been going down, mostly due to that decreasing area. Our yields are increasing, but there's still a large yield gap. So very briefly, I'm going to talk about the work that we did here in collaboration with Patricio on trying to quantify wheat yield gaps in the US, and that's what we see here in this map. In green, you see the wheat growing area, and then each one of those yellow stars, they are a reference weather station that we used for our yield gap analysis following the protocol established by the Global Yield Gap Atlas. So in this protocol, within each one of those blue circles, right, each one of those domains out there, we actually get true data and we calibrate our crop simulation models against the performance of the varieties in those domains. And then we, respecting the cropping systems and the typical soils that we have in those regions, we do long-term simulations of the yield potential using actual sowing dates and cultivar maturities. And if we briefly look at the results that we have for the country, this is in terms of yield potential, we see that there's quite a bit of variability, ranging from less than 3 tons per hectare to close to 8 or 9 tons per hectare in the soft wheat growing region. But overall, a yield potential, a dryland yield potential of 5.4 tons per hectare. Alencar, very exactly the same that you guys estimate for soybeans in Brazil out there. When we look at the difference between this yield potential and the actual yields, coming up with our yield gaps here, again, there's some regional variability there on the yield gaps, but across the entire country, our current yields are 48% of what the potential could be. That's a huge gap that we can actually try to fulfill through management, right? So in the remaining of this presentation, we're going to get into the intensification and see how far can we push. And I will use as example here the US Southern Great Plains, which is kind of where we are located from Nebraska and south here. It's a region that there's a lot of wheat, 6 million hectares of winter wheat harvested every year, contributes to about 35% of the US wheat production. Now we see a lot of climate zones there. Actually, we need 9 different climate zones to represent about 75% of the wheat area, so a lot of variability in weather conditions in this region. And more specifically, as a Kansas State University employee. I'm going to focus on Kansas, which is the largest winter wheat producing state in the country, producing about 20% of the total U.S. production. And even though it's a single state, we have 7 climate zones that represent about 70% of the wheat area. So a lot of variability in Kansas there as well. Okay, this photo here shows some of my motivation. Some of the motivation that I have to actually do the work that we're doing. This is a wheat field that I visited in 2016. It's a wheat field 30 miles from the Colorado border. If you know the region here, you know that it's really dry. But it is a wheat field that, through management, the managers of that farm are able to actually get really high yields on a consistent basis. Not management of the wheat phase only, but management of the whole system, right? Actually, this field here was 8.1 tons per hectare. It was the winner of the National Wheat Yield Contest, and these farmers, they kind of do that in a fairly consistent basis in terms of getting their fields to win some of these National Wheat Contests. If you take a look at your book that we got from the conference today, that's an awesome photo of a wheat field there as well. I don't think that we can reach there with our fields in Kansas, but looking at these and seeing how far we can push versus where we are is really what gives me a lot of motivation for what I'm going to show next to you. I'm glad that Patricio presented first, because we did a very similar survey of management practice, so it saved me some time here. But again, we visited with growers and we got information from planting dates to varieties to nitrogen management and so on, all the way to grain yield, management of nutrients, and when available, grain protein as well. We did that for 3 years and we got data from about close to 700 fields across the state. Those different colors that you see in terms of blue or purple, they are the wheat area in the background. The red dots, they are the fields that we actually interviewed. And we subdivided our data in those 3 larger climate zones. I mentioned before that we have 7, but actually we divided these in 3, so we use a little bit coarser climate zones, but still keeping a lot of the homogeneity there. Just to give you an example, that climate zone in purple here is in the west. It's a dry and cold weather versus the blue one, which is has more moisture on a yearly basis and is a warmer one as well. After collecting this data, we also did... There we go, yep. After collecting this data for each field, we ran a crop simulation model, collecting soil and weather data from each one of those fields. And here's the distribution of yields that we got across that survey, right? Going from 300 kilos per hectare all the way to over 7 tons per hectare in commercial wheat fields around the state, averaging 3.8, which is not too much higher than our average wheat yield in Kansas. In these years, we're close to 3.4, roughly. But still, in those simulations, in each one of these fields, a 44% yield gap. So very large yield gaps in these producers' fields as well. Interestingly here, we could do some association of grain yield and management practices, right? So when you look at sowing dates, we have on that yield potential, we have kind of like a quadratic function there, where in the western part of the state, yields were peaking at about September 28th, and then decreasing at a very steep rate if we're delaying planting past about October 10th or so. If we go to the warmer, more forgiving region, the peak was a little bit later, October 14th, and our yields really didn't start to decrease too steep until we got into November. So again, region-specific management recommendations based on grower data. Also comparing high and low yielding fields here for the 3 different regions, we saw some very consistent differences in the rates of nitrogen being applied, 30 to 40 kilos of nitrogen per hectare greater in higher yielding fields. Same thing in foliar fungicides, more frequent adoption of foliar fungicides in those higher yielding fields. In terms of global warming potential, we did a life cycle assessment here, looking at the global warming potential and energy balance from these fields. And we don't need to go over those details, but we accounted for all the manufacturing, packaging, transportation of those inputs being used. And what was interesting here, if we look at energy input, right, how much energy is putting in to produce each one of those crops, there's a fairly large range, but there's really no relationship with that energy input and grain yield. Meaning that some of these farmers are able to be very efficient with their input, using very few inputs here, and actually produce very high yields. Very similar results when we look at the global warming potential on a per hectare basis, a large range of global warming potentials there on a per hectare basis, but no relationship with grain yield. Again, suggesting an opportunity for us to understand what these growers are doing that are on that quadrant that is higher yields, lower global warming potential. And in terms of a per ton, right, now we're talking about per ton produced, there was also a range from less than 200 to more than 800 kilos of CO2 equivalent per ton of wheat produced. And what was interesting is, as our net energy yield increased in those fields, meaning that they were able to produce more, putting less, we also had a lower yield scale global warming potential. This was all done with farmer data. We went ahead and we ground truth some of those findings on the field as well. That's why you see in this photo is an example of one of the experiments that we ran. We did this in 21 different experiments where we're comparing the standard management of our growers with that extra nitrogen and extra fungicide coming from these surveyed fields, close to 6,000 observations or 3,000 comparisons there for anywhere from 20 to 50 different wheat varieties grown. We've done this with a number of collaborators in Texas and Oklahoma as well, so those yellow circles is where we actually ran that experiment. And if we just look at yield distribution, the standard management of the grower versus the more intensive, again, very simple, just more nitrogen and a fungicide application there, we're gaining about 900 kilos per hectare. So again, it's not something that they can't necessarily change. It's some fairly straightforward management they can change in the farm and actually achieve a much larger yield there. Reduction in the yield gap in about 20% or so. If we look at this data and take a look at the global warming potential, per hectare basis, we're putting more inputs. So we did have an increase in a per hectare global warming potential for that more intensive management. However, we need to feed a global population, right? And so when we look at a per ton produced, it was actually lower, meaning that we're producing more food, and per ton, actually, our global warming potential was lower. So some summary here from this data that we have so far. Very large wheat yield gaps in the US, about 52% of potential increase there. If you look at the potential for increased supply in Kansas alone, we're talking about almost 3 million metric tons of extra wheat that we could produce. In the US, and again, there's some asterisks there because I'm expanding the results from Kansas to the US, right? Because Kansas is the data that I have. Of course, we'll have to, ideally, do some similar studies across all those states that I mentioned before. But over 15 million metric tons of potential increased production of wheat in the US. Folks, this is 75% of Canada's production, and Canada is a top 10 growing country. Right, so there's a lot of room for us to improve wheat use and wheat production in the US. And especially with the current socioeconomic conflicts with Ukraine, this becomes more and more important. Possible to produce, at least on a per ton basis, with a lower footprint per unit grain produced. And I didn't show here, but in terms of economic, it was positive as well to go more intense. And human aspect here, we go more into the quality. I think there was a question earlier on quality of soybeans, but here we're talking about the quality of that bread produced. We're measuring these all the way to that bread, to the loaf of bread. So there is an improvement in the quality of the product as well. And finally, potential for changes in the supply chain in terms of sourcing programs and things along those lines. All of this gets back to growers. We go out and we have an extension appointment, and so putting this out to growers and sharing this information with them so we can actually try to see a change in the field. And I'd like to also take the chance here and acknowledge some of the collaborations that we have had over the years. And Patricio, I needed to put a photo of you on a wheat field there. I thought it was fitting. Amanda with Oklahoma State University, Clark with Texas Tech, now he's in Washington State, and of course my research group out there, a bunch of young and very active people helping us collect all of this data. With that, I appreciate your attention, and I'll be happy to get any questions if we have.
Yep.
What potential do you see hybrid wheat seed having to help reduce this yield gap?
Yeah, there's a great question, right? There's the potential for a hybrid wheat seed, and I think the BASF just canceled their full hybrid program in the US. That was hard to see. Talking with Syngenta about doing some testings with the hybrids that they have coming down the line, which they're releasing their first one for this season, I believe, in North Dakota for spring wheat. For winter wheat, they're a couple of years behind. They are talking about the heterosis of the hybrids being anywhere from 8 to 12%, right? So there will be a potential there. Cost of seed may be a concern, but that's where I kind of want to focus as well. Wheat is such a plastic plant that we can reduce those populations and still see really high yields. So I think there's a potential. The heterosis that they're claiming 8, 10, 12% will be a big bump there, as long as we can have enough production at scale to supply large areas, which seems to be the biggest limiting factor right now. Great question, yeah.
Yeah, and perhaps an important remark is that, yeah, a farmer can sit down and wait for the extra 300, 400 kgs that a hybrid will give them, but now they can consider to apply some nitrogen and some fungicide and get an increase of nearly 1 ton. So, you know, there are things that farmers can do now to increase their yields that is profitable, and as Romulo showed, it does decrease the environmental footprint per unit of production. So let's not forget that sometimes the essential is not invisible to the eyes. Yeah. Any other question? If not, we will move to the next and final speaker. Thank you very much. Welcome, Romulo. Yeah. All right, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Fernando Aramburu Merlos, who is originally from Argentina. Now he's perfect. Fernando got a PhD from University of California at Davis last year, and he's currently working at the University of Nebraska as a postdoc. And he's going to talk today about the intensification of maize-based systems in East Africa. Fernando, it's a great pleasure to have you today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricio, for the introduction. And as he said, I'm going to talk about maize in Sub-Saharan Africa, or basically in East Africa. And the title for this presentation is First Things First, Good Agronomy is Needed for Increasing Corn Yields and Self-Sufficiency in Sub-Saharan Africa. And so first I'm going to talk a little bit about why we need to help Sub-Saharan Africa to increase their corn yields, why is this important, and then I'm going to try to convince you about why good agronomy should be our top priority to achieve this. So, okay. As many of you may know, Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the places in the world where we have the greatest food insecurity problems. And one of the reasons for that is because Sub-Saharan Africa doesn't produce enough cereals or enough food to meet their demand. Here you can see that they produce about 80% of the cereals that they need to supply their demand. So the remaining 20% comes from imports or food aid from other countries. But what you may not know is that on top of that, corn demand is booming in Sub-Saharan Africa. If we check how the crop area of corn changed during the last 20 years, we can see that it increased at nearly 1 million hectares per year. So this is a very huge area increase, almost, comparable to soybean in Brazil that is much well known. And that is much more than any other cereals in the region. If we look forward, the corn demand is expected to increase about 2.65 times in the next 27 years. So right now, the corn demand is about 72 million of metric tons, and by 2050, it's going to be 191 million of metric tons. On the other hand, if we check how the yield changed during the last, also 20 years, we can see that the yield in Sub-Saharan Africa have improved very little, just from 1.5 to nearly 2 tons in 20 years. And if we compare that with the yield improvement or the yield progress in other regions of the world, such as South America and Southeast Asia, that have like a comparable biophysical background, we can see that the yield improvement is less than 20% of what have happened in other places of the world. And this is not because they don't have the environmental capability, I mean that the environment is limiting the yield. Because if we check the yield gap that we have talked about so much about yield gap this morning, we can see that the yield gap is about 80 to 90% or 70% of the yield potential, or the rainfed yield potential, pretty much everywhere in Sub-Saharan Africa. So if we combine these two things, like how the food demand or the corn demand will increase in the next 27 years, and if we assume that the corn area won't increase anymore and the yield will keep increasing at the same slow rate, we get that by 2050, the imports will be about 82 millions of metric tons per year. And that is twice the Nebraska corn production. So they will need to import all the corn that is produced in Nebraska twice. And that leads to a self-sufficiency ratio of only like 55%. They will have to import like 45% of their corn production. So just as a conclusion from this part is that we don't have any time to, we cannot wait any more time, and we need to help Sub-Saharan Africa to improve the corn production sustainably. And next I'm going to try to show you why we need to do this by promoting good basic agronomy. So last year, when I joined Patricio's lab here in Nebraska, we partnered with 1 Acre Fund and Regrow in this project to try to identify the main causes of yield gap in Eastern Africa. And I want to talk about a little bit about 1 Acre Fund, that is an NGO that provides farmers with a technology package and with resources to try to improve the production of different crops. One of the main one is corn. And they also provide microloans and crop insurance, and they follow all the production processes of smallholders, and then they make sure that they apply the best technologies that they consider they could help them to achieve a better yield. By 2021, they helped to around 3.2 million smallholder farmers in Eastern Africa. And what they, so in order to track how they are impacting these smallholder farmers, 1 Acre Fund collected data from smallholder farmers that subscribed to the program and also from other farmers that did not subscribe to have a control. So they collected data from more than 14,000 fields from many different countries. And so they went to the field and measured the corn yield of the different fields. They also collected the location of the field, and they conducted a survey to try to get information about the main management practices that these smallholder farmers applied. Either they were subscribed or not subscribed to their program. So they collected information about nutrients, planting, like planting dates, density, row spacing, cultivar, whether they use local seed or whether they bought some hybrid, pests, and whether they, apply any soil amendments. So when we saw that they had this data, we offered them to analyze this data with all the know-how that we have in our group to analyze farmers' data. So we took their data and applied the spatial framework and the statistical methods that you, Patricio and Romulo, have shown for the US. So first we went through a thorough data cleaning process. Then we stratified the data based on climate zones to make fair comparisons among fields. And finally, we used these advanced statistical methods to handle the uncertainty in this data. So I want to show you first a little bit about what we found in this big database. And something changed here. And then I'm going to show you what we found about being the main factors affecting the maize yield. Here you can see where are the locations for those 14,000 fields we collect the data, or they collect the data from Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, and Kenya. And as you can see here, you have the yield for the different countries, and yields vary all the way from 1 ton per hectare to almost 5 tons per hectare in some fields. Nitrogen applications are on average around 30 kilograms per hectare, but you can see that many farmers don't apply any nitrogen, and some farmers applied at most 40 to 50 kilograms of nitrogen. Plant densities are very low comparable to other places in the world, about only 2 or 3 plants or 4 plants per square meter. And phosphorus applications are also relatively low. Many farmers are using hybrids already, but still 20% of farmers don't use open pollination varieties. Planting date or sowing date is pretty variable. It changes from they have like a 2-month sowing window, and most of the labor is manual, like manual sowing, manual weeding. Only a few apply, or 1/3 apply insecticides, and there are no fungicide applications. So what we found when we analyzed this data, it's not surprising that the main factor that was explaining the yield variation and the yield gaps in the region was nitrogen fertilization rate. The second management practice that had the greatest impact was fertilizer placement, and this is something that not many people will know, but if they apply the limited fertilizer into a hole, that is much better than just broadcasting the fertilizer. It's much work, but it has a very big impact. Then there was a lot of impact of sowing date, that also because it's so variable, if they sow early, they get much better results. And you can see all of the other practices here that we found as having a strong impact. And these practices change a little depending on the region, whether we are in one of these 4 countries. So what we did next is to try to group farmers in different groups in order to see how much was the yield progress that farmers that were using the best management practices that we identified, how much was the yield compared to the control of the farmers that didn't apply these technologies. So we start here with the actual yield. Try with this. So this is the yield, the average yield of East Africa is about 2 tons per hectare. And that yield is very similar to the farmers that didn't apply any of these technologies, or that only used local seed or open pollination varieties, that they used almost any nitrogen, very low plant densities, and late sowing days. So this is our baseline. It's very similar to the average farmer's yield in the region. Farmers that use hybrids instead of open pollination varieties, but still didn't apply any nitrogen or very low nitrogen, got a yield improvement of about 200 kilograms per hectare. But when they added nitrogen, and it's like 52 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, is not a lot of nitrogen, but they already get like a 1 ton increase over the baseline and reach like 3 tons per hectare. And of course, the nitrogen has a big cost in East Africa, and it's not easy for farmers to get this fertilizer. So maybe 1 ton of yield increase is not very compelling, but if we start adding more management practices that have very low cost, we can see that the yield improvement is much bigger. For example, if we switch from only 2 or 3 plants per hectare, per square meter to almost 5 plants per square meter, we get another 1 ton of yield increase. And if we all, on top of that, try to implement early sowing days, once at the beginning of the rainy season, then we can have another 500 kilograms of yield improvement. So as you can see, if we compare the highest technology in our data, farmers' data, with the baseline, we have like a 2.2 times yield increase. We are producing more than twice the yield of the average yield in the region. And this is a lot of yield improvement, but it's still very low compared to the attainable yield in the region. So we talk about yield gaps. Yield gaps are still huge, even for these technology farmers, but the improvement is remarkable. So the main take-home message here is that, Sub-Saharan Africa really needs to increase the maize yield because demand is booming, it's increasing really fast. And in order to achieve this, we can see that with simple combination of basic good agronomic practices, such as use of hybrids, fertilizer, pest control measures, early sowing dates, we can deliver in very fast, large, and quick yield increases. So we think that research and development programs and policy should be tuned to facilitate these practices. And to facilitate this, we need to facilitate the farmer access to inputs and technological information. So One Acre Fund is one good example of a kind of an NGO that is working on this, but we think that this example has to be replicated in many other places. And given the current high food demand and reliance on imports, we think that Sub-Saharan Africa should not be used as a testing ground for approaches largely improving on their capacity to increase yields. So we should start putting our priorities on things that we know that work, that have worked in other places, and that's why we try to promote good agronomy for Sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
So we are running out of time, and the lunch, I guess, is going to be ready very soon if it is not already. So maybe we will take one question, and then we will let you run for lunch. Yeah, that happens when you are in between, 5 presentations in lunch. Oh, here. Oh, you can stay this.
Fernando, thank you very much. I like your last conclusion that we should not be promoting unproven options and should be science-based recommendations. What's your opinion about these competing ways of thinking of sustainable intensification to agronomy, better agronomy, nature positive, which is going in one direction, or agroecological options that are going in another direction for the same types of farmers that we have in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Nice question, thank you. So I think that, our priorities should be clear, and if we see that there is a big limitation in yields, it's very hard to try to impose them things that are not, that other countries haven't did in the past. It's very easy for people. I study in Davis, California, and agroecology is a big thing there and everything, but they have already a very intensified system. So de-intensifying that system is easy. But if you are talking about the place where you can go and see that plants don't have any nutrients or anything, first you need to solve these problems, and then you can think about something else.
All right. We made it, Fatima, not nearly on time, but we did our best. So sorry for that. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for being loyal with us and staying until 12:10. And I also want to thank very much all the 5 speakers for their presentations. Let's give them a final round of applause.